No matter how it might have happened, the deplatforming of Wallace is undeniable. It's Darwinism that sucks up all the oxygen in the room, and except for a hardcore of Wallace devotees, we don't really hear much about Wallaceism. That's a pity, because Wallace was, in his day, at the top rank of British science. His reputation lives on mostly as the founder of an entirely new field of study, biogeography, what led to his insight of Wallace's line, for example. As an evolutionary biologist, though, Wallace is an asterisk. Why? Well, there's a deeper story to tell here, one that paints both Wallace and Darwin in an unaccustomed light. And this light casts a shadow over the entire Darwinian idea, and, to be fair, the entire Wallacean idea. This lets us see another way to think about Wallace's deplatforming. The stumbling block for both was the evolution of humans and culture. Now, before we go into that story, I want to add a disclaimer. Both Darwin and Wallace were products of their times, and those times included the many essentially racist and jingoistic tropes that permeated Victorian England. I say this not to level a moral judgment against Darwin and Wallace. What I want to do, rather, is to explore the logic of Wallace's and Darwin's different thoughts about human evolution, the logic as they saw it. And to do so, we cannot look at Wallace and Darwin through our contemporary eyes. We need to look at it through their eyes. Okay, with that said, both Darwin and Wallace encountered many indigenous cultures on their respective expeditions of discovery. Let's look at Darwin's experience first. Darwin's most memorable encounter was with the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, the archipelago on the southern tip of South America. Captain Fitzroy had visited the archipelago several years previously, also on a Royal Navy surveying expedition. Then he had navigated and partially mapped the Beagle Channel, south of the Straits of Magellan. He was returning to the Beagle Channel on this trip to complete his survey from his previous visit. This painting, by the way, depicts the Beagle at anchor in the Beagle Channel. The painting is by Conrad Martins, whom Fitzroy had employed as the ship's artist. Fitzroy had another, more personal agenda. He was very active in the London Missionary Society, or the LMS, and we'll have more to say on that momentarily. This portrait of a Fuegian man, also painted by Conrad Martins, exemplifies Darwin's conception of the Fuegians as a low, degraded, and primitive people. Darwin's negative impression of the Fuegians was reinforced by the outcome of Fitzroy's missionary experiment. On his previous expedition, Fitzroy had literally taken 3 Fuegian natives and transported them back to England. There, his friends in the LMS could civilize them and convert them to Christianity. As part of this Pygmalion-like exercise, the 3 were given whimsical, insulting actually, English names. Upon returning to the archipelago, it was Fitzroy's intent to plant his newly civilized Fuegians back among their native tribes, as instruments to plant the seeds of civilization and Christianity among the Fuegians, which would lift them up from savagery. The experiment was a disastrous failure. Fitzroy dropped off the 3 Fuegians, along with an English missionary to help them, and went off to complete his survey of the Beagle Channel. When he returned a couple of weeks later, the 3 Fuegians had shed their painstakingly constructed English facades and had reassimilated almost completely with the native Fuegian tribe. The missionary, for his part, had been set upon almost immediately after the departure of the Beagle, had his belongings taken, and his primitive shelter knocked down. Needless to say, he was eager to get back onto the Beagle and to return to England. The lesson Darwin drew from this was that the Fuegians were immune to improvement. Like highly bred pigeon breeds, when released into their native populations, they very quickly reverted to type. And Darwin never entirely shed this contemptuous attitude toward the Fuegians. Okay, now for Wallace. Unlike Darwin, who had had only a fleeting and superficial acquaintance with the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego, Wallace was deeply embedded in the cultures of the diverse people of the Malay archipelago. He spent 8 years there. He worked closely with a diverse range of local people and tribes. Some he employed as assistants. Some he had to negotiate access to their lands. Some he depended upon for accommodation and hospitality. He learned some of their languages and much of their vernacular knowledge of the natural history. So it's fair to say that Wallace and Darwin would have different things to say about human diversity and human evolution. What's surprising is just what the points of difference were. Again, let me reiterate that disclaimer. Both Darwin and Wallace were products of their times, and their times were very different from ours. So, their views on human evolution need to be explored in that light. It was a common trope at the time that human cultures were arrayed along a hierarchy. At the pinnacle were the civilized races, white Englishmen, to put it bluntly. At the bottom were the savage races, those that lived in a so-called state of nature. Someone who lives in nature is the actual meaning of that word, by the way. Somewhere in the middle, straddling the divide, were the so-called barbaric races, human cultures that had the elements of civilization, either presently or at some time in their past. Both Darwin and Wallace, being Englishmen, clearly regarded their own cultures as civilized. For Darwin, the Fuegians were set firmly in the savage category. For Wallace, the mountain-dwelling Dayak tribesmen of Borneo were the exemplar of a savage race. The popular description of the Dayak at the time were wild men of Borneo. They were feared as headhunters, for example. You can imagine the lurid possibilities for popular culture. You don't have to, actually. P.T. Barnum was there 150 years ago. Look it up on Google. I'm not going to put up any of those images here. Darwin's experience with the 3 Fuegians on board the Beagle shaped his opinion on the evolution of humans. He was convinced that the Fuegians had the capacity to rise from savagery, but their scope for doing so was limited. They could, at best, be elevated to a temporary state of barbarism. But this was only a facade. That they reverted right back to their savage culture was compelling evidence for Darwin that the Fuegians, while fully human, exemplified an intermittent stage of human evolution. Wallace had quite a different experience and set of impressions. Like Darwin, he was comfortable with the idea that so-called savage tribesmen could be brought up to a more civilized status. This, by the way, is a photograph of Ali, who worked closely with Wallace throughout his sojourn in the Malay archipelago. Unlike Darwin, however, Wallace's close acquaintance with the people had convinced him that the intellectual and moral capacity of so-called savage people was every bit the equivalent of civilized humans. Their differing experiences led both Darwin and Wallace to quite different thoughts about human evolution, and let's illustrate those differing ideas graphically. Let's suppose we have an axis along which we map degree of civilization, like the vertical gradation on the left, but now arrayed horizontally. We do that for both the civilized Englishmen and the savage Fuegians. We're keeping the color coding from that vertical gradient to the left. Blue is civilized, brown is savage, and gold is barbaric. Darwin would have put the civilized races farther to the right on this axis compared to the savage Fuegian. To Darwin, there was nothing special about this. To him, this was simply an expression of variation of traits. Variation in capacity for civilization was, in principle for him, the same as variation in, say, pigeon breeds. Okay, let's now turn to Wallace. Wallace regarded the so-called savage Dayak as every bit the intellectual and moral equivalent of the Englishman. In our graph, these brown lines indicate capacity for civilization, and they're the same for both savage Dayak and civilized Englishmen. Wallace explained the difference between savage and civilized as a difference in the extent to which that intellectual capacity was used. The civilized person used a fuller range of their innate mental capacities. In comparison, the savage Dayak left their mental capabilities for civilization unused. They did not need them to be able to successfully live their lives. Okay, lots of landmines scattered around here. Let's clear that minefield away so that we can focus on Darwin's and Wallace's contrasting views on human evolution. Darwin's solution was to treat human evolution as something akin to the evolution of costly traits, like the spectacular displays of the peacock. In Darwin's thinking, such spectacular displays were costly and therefore unlikely to arise through natural selection. So, what did? Darwin thought that what drove such seemingly counterproductive traits was mate choice. Peacocks evolved those extreme displays because, well, peahens liked them. In other words, the evolution of such spectacular displays was driven not by any convergence on efficient form and function, as natural selection might be expected to do. Rather, they were driven by an aesthetic, a sense of beauty, if you will. To Darwin, this was an evolutionary principle quite different from natural selection. He called his idea sexual selection. Human evolution, Darwin argued, was driven by sexual selection, not by natural selection. If both the evolution of the Fuegian and the Englishman were driven by an aesthetic sense of beauty, it would be the perception of beauty that was the driver. Women's perception of beauty would turn on whether males could show that they could provide for themselves and for their offspring. Traits like physical strength, intelligence, and capability. The more prominently these were displayed to women, the more likely those would be good choices for mates. Men's perception of beauty would turn on women's displays of signs of fecundity and fidelity. Darwin explained the differences between savage and civilized by differing standards of beauty between human cultures. What was beautiful to the Fuegians would be different from what was beautiful to the English, and so they would evolve toward different types of cultures. Okay, let's turn now to Wallace. The key thing about Wallace's views was that he regarded all humans to have a complex brain and mind, no matter what state of nature they lived in. Compared to Darwin, Wallace thought the Dayak were every bit as mentally capable as any European, and in this he was relatively enlightened compared to Darwin. The problem for Wallace was how to explain why the Dayak persisted in a state of savagery, even though they were fully capable of civilization. The complex societies and accomplishments for civilized humans fully engaged the mental capabilities of the complex human brain. In other words, for people living in nature, however, like those Dayak tribesmen, Wallace thought that only a small part of their mental capacities was used. So while the Dayak were mentally equipped for civilized life, they did not live a civilized life. And this left a large part of their mental capacity unused, which was why civilized and savage humans were, in fact, not equal. The conundrum for Wallace was why the brains and minds of the savage Dayak seemed over-designed for the types of lives they led, that they seemed to have more mind than they needed to survive and prosper. Natural selection should, in Wallace's reasoning, select for limited capacity there, similar to Darwin's argument for the savage Fuegians. Wallace simply could not see how natural selection could produce brains that had far more capacity than was needed. Wallace was an uber selectionist. He was more Darwin than Darwin, to quote a common phrase. He rejected Darwin's claim that sexual selection could be a distinct mechanism from natural selection. To Wallace, sexual selection was just another form of natural selection, even if Darwin himself failed to see it. And that was one reason why Wallace came increasingly to ruffle Darwin's feathers. This posed a conundrum for Wallace. If natural selection could not explain the origin of the human mind, what could? Wallace took a surprising path towards his answer, which aggravated Darwin and his colleagues farther. If natural selection could not explain the evolution of the mind, Wallace thought that the only explanation left was that some external agency had directed it. Starting from some simpler foundation, like the brain, say, of an ape, this external agency exerted some force that drew the brain into the complex modern brain. And from there, culture would shape how much the brain's mental capacity was used. In primitive cultures, the brain would be relatively underused, and in civilized cultures, the brain would be more fully utilized. For Wallace, the important question was what this external agency might be, and this posed another conundrum. Wallace was a socialist and an atheist, and this meant that whatever this external agency was, it could not be God. And if not God, then what? This is where Wallace starts to be seriously misunderstood, both by his contemporaries and to the present day. And the misunderstanding is over Wallace's turn to spiritualism. You know, the kind of thing with seances and spirit mediums and weird things that go bump in the night. Did Wallace go off the deep end here? Well, many thought so, including Darwin. In their view, Wallace's flirtation with spiritualism disqualified him as a serious scientific thinker, so he had to be deplatformed. We're depressingly familiar these days with that way of treating heterodoxy. Then, as now, it's a lazy argument. Too much trouble to engage with the argument? Better to make it just go away. But why did Wallace decide to delve into spiritualism? Again, context is important. In the late 19th century, spiritualism was not the source of mockery it is today. That idea came only in the early 20th century, at the hands of Harry Houdini of all people. In Wallace's time, however, spiritualism was regarded as a sort of scientific religion that could step in to take the place of the increasingly embattled established religions. Spiritualism could then serve the religious impulses of people who could not bring themselves to a belief in God. In light of that, Discover magazine's description of Darwin as the bringer of an evolutionary gospel takes on particular relevance. But by masquerading as scientific religion, spiritualism could claim a mantle of scientific respectability, and as such, it became all the rage among the right thinkers of the day, especially among the free thinkers and atheist socialists, which describes Wallace to a T. Wallace hoped spiritualism could be a scientific tool to explore the nature of that troublesome external agency. Wallace thought that the spirit medium acted as a sort of radio receiver, an antenna of sorts that could tune into the external agency's force field, whatever that was. The seance and the spirit medium were therefore the experimental tools whereby Wallace could study this external agency, whatever that was. Now, it's easy to fault Wallace here for taking a dive into the deep end of a wacky idea, but we shouldn't be too hard on him. The late 19th century was full of seemingly wacky ideas. Thomas Huxley, for example, was engaged at the time in his own wacky crusade over spontaneous generation, the kind of thing that's mocked in nearly all biology textbooks these days. So why was Wallace eclipsed and not, say, Huxley? Good question. I don't really have a good answer, but here's mine anyway. For a time, both Darwin and Wallace were on broadly equal footing with their advocacy of a law-mediated evolution, that is, evolution driven by a mechanism, natural selection. By insisting on a law-driven mechanism, neither Darwin nor Wallace had any need to invoke strange forces of adaptation or complexity to explain the origin of species, as Lamarck and Cuvier had done. For that matter, forces that Darwin's own grandfather had toyed with. To Darwin, just allow the mechanism to operate and the continuous generation of new species will be the outcome. Unfortunately, this pretense was undone when both Darwin and Wallace turned to the evolution of human mind and culture. Neither Darwin nor Wallace thought that natural selection could adequately explain the origin of the human mind and intelligence. Darwin took the approach of doubling down on mechanism. Natural selection was one mechanism, but Darwin didn't think natural selection need be the only mechanism, so he invented another mechanism, namely sexual selection, to fill in where natural selection left off. In this way, Darwin remained true to his goal to explain all evolution as driven by some kind of mechanistic law. Wallace, on the other hand, resorted to positing some kind of external force to explain human evolution. And in this, he committed the ultimate Darwinian sin. He abandoned the idea of law-driven mechanism that was the center of the Darwinian idea. And that was the real reason Wallace's reputation as a serious scientist had to be degraded. Why Wallace became Darwin's moon. Okay, maybe that's so, maybe not, but here's my take. Both Darwin and Wallace were actually edging up to evolution as a cognition-driven phenomenon. Sexual selection, for example, was driven by a cognitive perception of beauty. The dilemma for Darwin was that sexual selection could not be mechanism alone. Rather, it had to be driven by cognition, by the cognitive perception of beauty. As for Wallace, his instinct that the evolution of mind could not be explained by natural selection was actually a correct one. Where Wallace went wrong was his failure to see the cognitive dimension that sexual selection had to entail. Wallace was an uber-selectionist, remember? He was literally unable to see that sexual selection could be anything but natural selection. Wallace held this in common, by the way, with the founders of the genetic theory of natural selection, which supposedly threw Darwinism its lifeline in the early 20th century. They also were uber-selectionists. This left Wallace with only one real choice on where to go next. He needed some kind of intelligent agency that could draw up the evolution of the complex human mind, to pre-adapt the brain, so to speak, for the great civilizing role it would come to play. Phew, talk about teleology, the very thing that natural selection was supposed to do away with. I don't happen to think Wallace was wrong, so much as he wrongly located the agency. By proposing an external agency, Wallace was forced into the very thing he opposed, the notion of a creator God, a Platonic God. But there's no reason why we have to place the agency externally. It could, as I have been arguing, be the intelligence and purposefulness that is inherent in cognition and homeostasis. So both Darwin and Wallace were edging up to a renunciation of the very thing that had made both of them famous. Neither were able to take that step over the threshold. And that was the rock upon which Darwinism foundered in the late 19th century. When Darwinism was rescued in the 1920s through the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the conundrum was solved by simply jettisoning the whole idea that there could be something unique about life.